Today, we're going to talk about two monumental Jewish figures. And the reason why we're talking about the two of them is because yesterday, the day before yesterday, was the yahrzeit of one of them, Moses Maimonides, and in 2 days from now, on Tuesday, will be the yahrzeit of the other, the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad leader, Rabbi Schneur Zalman of Liadi. And the fact that they were both, their yahrzeits are juxtaposed, suggests that there is something that they have in common, although each one contributed in a different way, but they had a unifying force that brings them together. So I want to first discuss, going in chronological order, Maimonides, who was known to us by his initials of his name and his father's name as Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. The two most influential Jews of the medieval period were Rashi and Rambam. We'll discuss Rashi some other time. His yahrzeit isn't for another few months. But Rambam, without any question, had the greatest impact on Jewish life of the medieval period. And to this day, Rambam is a central figure in Jewish scholarship. There is no one who studies Talmud and other Judaic subjects who has not come across Rambam dozens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of times. I can't remember a day in yeshiva when we were studying Talmud where Maimonides was not mentioned. I'm sure it happened every now and then, but it's something that it's hard to remember when and where it happened. So great was Maimonides, Moses Maimonides, that on his tombstone it has the expression, Mimoshe vi'ad Moshe lokom kamoshe. From Moses to Moses, no one has arisen as great as Moses. There's even a hint in the Torah about Moses Maimonides. You say, well, the Torah was written before Maimonides. Yes, absolutely, but the Torah has everything in it, even things of the future. There's a hint in the book of Exodus where it talks about how God says to Moses, I'm going to multiply my wonders in the land of Egypt. Those four Hebrew words, Revot, Movtai, Be'eretz, Mitzrayim, the initials of that is Rambam. And it's the only place in the whole Torah where you could find those initials. And it's about Moses who performed wonders in Egypt. Well, our Moses Maimonides, was also a performer of wonders of another kind in the land of Egypt. Maimonides was a Talmudist, in fact, the greatest of his time, arguably. He was a theologian and a philosopher, the greatest of his time and of many centuries before and after. He was a physician of note. He was the physician of Saladin, the famous Saladin. He was an astronomer of note. But more importantly, he was a selfless leader. He was a warrior, an iconoclast, and a passionate lover and defender of Israel, of the Jewish people. He had nothing, he feared no one or nothing if he had to promote an idea that was truth, and he had to protect his people. So let's talk a little bit about his biography, and then a little bit more later about some of his philosophy. Rambam did not grow up in a vacuum. He was the son of a very great sage himself, Rabbi Maimon, who was born in 1110. Rambam, by the way, was born in 1135. Although Rambam was a man of a lot of controversies, there's even a controversy about the exact year he was born. Some say he was born in 1138, but the accepted date is 1135. His father was a scion of a rabbinic family. Maimonides himself traces his family 7 generations of dayanim, of judges, rabbinic judges, and he was a descendant of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the compiler and editor of the Mishnah. He came from a very aristocratic rabbinic family. Born in Cordoba, Spain, the day he was born was the day before Passover, the 14th day of the month of Nisan in the afternoon. It's interesting that that hint in the Torah to Maimonides' title that I mentioned before deals with Maimonides' birthday, 14th day of Nisan in the afternoon. He had a very difficult life, extremely difficult. The fanatical Almohads, there was a sect of Islam that did away with the golden age that the Jewish people lived with Muslims and Arabs for 500 years. And Jews were second-class citizens, but second-class citizens that had rights, that had freedom, and were very important to the caliphs and the leaders of all the Muslim countries. But the Almohads brought that to an end. They were a fanatical group who believed that everyone has to convert to Islam, and they enforced it at the pain of death for anyone who would refuse. So Maimonides' father and family had to flee Spain, and for 11 years, I believe, they were on the run until they settled in Morocco, Fez, Morocco. The problem with that, it's a historical fact, we don't have any question about that, but the problem is the Almohads came from Morocco. So he's running from the, what does the expression go, from the frying pan onto the fire. They were centered in Morocco and they expanded their control over Spain. So Maimonides is running away, his family, from Spain to Morocco. So there are a lot of theories of how that happened and how he was able to survive in Morocco. Some say there was a very great rabbi there who was close to the government, and they gave him some dispensation. They allowed him to be Jewish. But I'm not going to go into the different theories how he was able to survive, but ultimately he had to leave Morocco as well. There's a story attached to it that why he had to flee Morocco, because one day he was going with a lulav and etrog on the holiday of Sukkot, and an Arab sees him and says, "This is a joke. Judaism is a joke, and look how foolish you are by carrying these things." And Maimonides did not remain silent, and he showed him how foolish Islam is. And of course, he had to flee. And he fled to Israel. And he stayed in Israel for about a half a year. And the conditions in Israel were so intolerable that he could not stay in Israel, and he moved to Alexandria, Egypt. And from there, he ultimately moved to Fastat, that was a suburb of Cairo, and that's where he spent the rest of his life. He passed away in Cairo, or the suburb of Cairo, the Jewish quarters, in the year 1204. So he was born in 1135, and he lived until 1204. He was shy 83 days of his 70th birthday. What catapulted Maimonides to fame? How did he become such a celebrated Jewish leader? You know, scholars come a dime a dozen, but they're not necessarily leaders. Because of the fanatical Almohads who banned Judaism, and you had to profess you were a Muslim, many Jews left Spain, as Maimonides' family did, but many of them were reluctant to leave their homeland. So what did they do? They made a compromise. They said, you know what, we'll profess to be Muslims. Maybe we'll go to the mosque to pray, to show that we're Muslims, but in our homes we'll remain Jewish. We'll pray to God the Jewish way. We'll practice all the commandments. We'll study Torah. See, the Almohads were not like the Catholics in the 15th, 16th century with the Inquisition, where if they discovered that you practiced Judaism in a cellar, you would be put to death. The Almohads were just satisfied that you publicly professed to be Muslim. So what many Jews did is they lived a double life. Publicly, they were Muslims. Privately, they were Jews. A rabbi from outside of Spain who remains unidentified, we don't know who this rabbi was, he wrote a scathing letter attacking the Jews of Spain for this double life, calling them evil, telling them that they should not even bother practicing Judaism, their Judaism is worthless, and either they give their lives not to betray Judaism, or just forget about being Jews. And this was so demoralizing to the Jewish people of Spain. Maimonides wrote a letter. It's a letter that combines tremendous amount of scholarship and also his heart. You could see the kind of heart that Maimonides had, the love that he had for his brethren. And he shows in this letter that rabbi was totally off the wall. He didn't know what he was talking about. A Jew is a Jew, and even if he does something wrong, every mitzvah that he or she does has value. And this letter catapulted him into fame because it literally saved who knows how many thousands of Jews from total apostasy, from total conversion. Many of the Jews said, okay, we'll follow what that rabbi said, we'll become Muslims. So that's the letter that really showed not only his intellect, but also his heart and the power that he had to be a leader. Maimonides was a very prolific writer. He was running from one place to another, but as he was running, he was composing scholarly works. His first major work that he started in his 20s was a commentary on the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the first body of Jewish law that was written after the Bible. And the Mishnah is a closed book. It's a hard book to read because it was written very tersely. So you have to study the Talmud to understand the Mishnah. But not everyone could understand Talmud and study Talmud, but they want to study the Mishnah. They want to get the basics. So Maimonides wrote a commentary that's a digest of what the Talmud says, adding his own commentary as well, and clarifying the Mishnah, making the Mishnah accessible and intelligible to even people who were not great scholars. He wrote it in Arabic, in Judeo-Arabic. He used Hebrew letters, but the Arabic language, the Jewish dialect of Arabic. Why did he do it in that language? Because Maimonides was a very humble man. You know, in Judaism, the people that we know that we are famous are also known for their humility. Moses was the greatest Jewish leader of all times. He was also the most humble person on the face of the earth. Maimonides was also the giant scholar, but he was extremely humble. He didn't think that his work would ever be appreciated by scholars. He wrote it for the masses, and the masses didn't speak Hebrew or Aramaic, which is the language of the Talmud. They spoke Arabic. It's like today's Yiddish for those who speak Yiddish, or today's English. If you go into yeshiva anywhere in America, you'll hear them talking what they say is English. It's actually yeshiva-ese. There are a few words in English. The linking words are English. And, with, to, for. But so that's what he did. He wrote it in a language for the masses. But once it became publicized, it became a major classic of Jewish scholarship. And that book is not only a commentary on the Mishnah, there are several books, small books within that book. For example, there's a book called The 8 Chapters. It's an introduction to ethics of the fathers. And it's a book unto itself. It's a religious psychological text. But the most famous little book within his larger commentary is the one in which he establishes the Jewish creed. What does a Jew have to believe in? And he enunciates 13 principles of faith. And some Jews recite these every single morning. And if those who don't recite it but subscribe to it, and one of those is the one that we have been speaking about for many weeks. Ani mamin be'emunah shlema bebias haMashiach. I believe with perfect faith in the coming of the Mashiach. And the Rambam elaborates on these 13 principles. So that became a book unto itself. He also, I guess, while he was fleeing from one place to another, wrote a small book called The Treatise on Logic. It's a philosophical work. He also wrote a commentary on the Talmud. We only have a few fragments of it. It was lost. He also took the Jerusalem Talmud and abridged it so that people could study it and get the practical knowledge out of it without all the analysis. That itself was a scholarly work. We only have a fragment of it. So a good part of his work was lost. But the miracle is that most of his works were preserved. He moved to Egypt in 1165. He was 30 years old when he got to Egypt. And how did he support himself? What does everyone know about Maimonides' profession? Physician. No, he wasn't a physician at first. He was a scholar who was supported by his rich brother. He had a younger brother who was a diamond merchant and who traveled to India, import, export, extremely wealthy. And he supported Maimonides. There was a partnership that he would work and make money, and Maimonides would study. Maimonides did not work for a living. His job was to study Torah and to teach until his brother drowned in a shipwreck in one of his journeys. And it happened at the same time, within a year or two, that he lost his father, that he lost his first wife, and some say he lost 2 children, all within a span of a few years. But what devastated him the most, and this is a little hard to understand, but who are we to judge someone else's suffering and pain, that his brother's death, probably because that was the last thing, that was the worst of all. Maimonides writes that it took him a year. He was in bed. He got so sick from his grief that he couldn't function for a full year. It's something that Maimonides himself counsels against, of grieving more than is normal, whatever that means. Because his brother was no longer alive, he now inherited his brother's widow and the brother's child. So that he had to support not only his own family, he remarried and he had a son, but he had to support his brother's family. So what did he do? He became a physician. Now he trained in medicine in his younger years. He studied under some very prominent Muslim physicians. The Muslims were actually the most advanced academically. People have an image of the Muslims are all very backward. They don't believe in science. They don't believe in philosophy. They were the scientists. They were the philosophers. The Christians were living in the Dark Ages, but the Muslims were in the Golden Age, had all this tremendous knowledge that the Jews themselves gained from as well. Maimonides studied philosophy. He studied medicine from Muslim scholars, and he gives them a lot of credit as well. So he became a physician. And because of his skill, he became a physician to Saladin and Saladin's successor. Because he was so influential, he was appointed to be the chief rabbi of the Egyptian Jewry, and he never took a penny for his services as a rabbinic leader. In fact, Maimonides had an opinion, which was not accepted by most rabbis, that a rabbi is not allowed to get paid for his services. The Rambam also believed that rabbinic judges, which is another function of the rabbi, should not get paid. They have to have other types of employment. So he became a physician when he could no longer be supported by his brother. Maimonides was also a very warm person, a very loving person, but he was a very strong leader. And when he had to fight against heresies, he went all the way out. For example, Egypt, the dominant Jewish force in Egypt were the Karaites. The Karaites were a sect of Jews who broke away from traditional Judaism, claiming that the oral Torah, which is the basis of Judaism, was made up by the rabbis, and therefore we should only follow the literal text of the Torah and not the oral tradition. So they rejected the Talmud, which contained the oral teachings after centuries of being transmitted orally. And they were very powerful in Egypt, and Maimonides fought them and defeated them and put them out of power. And the traditional Jews became the more dominant group in Egypt. In Egypt, he started to form the most important work of his, called the Mishnah Torah. That was his magnum opus. No work has ever been written by one person of that magnitude, of that scope, of that clarity, and that depth. Maimonides realized that if a Jew wants to know how to live his or her life, the source of that, of course, is the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the Mishnah, the Gemara, the Talmud, and the commentaries on the Talmud, and the writings of the later sages, post-Talmudic. So the average person would get totally lost. There's no way that an average person, even an average scholar, could master all of this knowledge. But he did. He mastered all of this knowledge, committed it all to memory. He had a phenomenal memory, and he had a great library. In those days, library meant that every book that you had was handwritten by a scribe. And he had a large library. He had many versions of the Talmud. Some versions, the text was not so correct, and he would correct them. He also wrote his own Torah scroll. He was a scribe. He wrote his own Torah scroll, 304,805 letters. Takes a long time to write a Torah scroll. Where did he have this time when he was running? Well, in Egypt he wasn't running, but he was busy being a physician. In one of his letters, he writes to someone who wanted to come visit him. He says, I don't have time to see you. All day long I'm in the palace treating the king and his harem and his ministers. And when I come home, I have lines of people waiting for me to treat them. And I haven't eaten a thing the whole day. I take a bite and I lay down on a couch. Instead of the patient laying on a couch, he laid on the couch. And he would treat his patients until late in the night. He says, when do I have time to meet with people? That was obviously not his whole life like that, but he became very, very busy. But nevertheless, he wrote his magnum opus, the Mishnah Torah, which collects all of Jewish knowledge, practical Jewish knowledge, into an encyclopedic work of 14 volumes. Really, it's 83 small volumes. It's a colossal, monumental work. The organization of it, the skill, the way he organizes all of Jewish law is incredible. The lucidity, the clarity of his language, and the depth. You look at his writings and you look at a word and you see that word was put there to help clarify the whole subject. And before he wrote that book, he wrote another book to serve as an outline. He made a list of the 613 commandments. The Talmud says that there are 613 commandments, but if you start counting, you'll find much more than 613. So how do we get to number 613? So he develops a system to figure out what is considered a commandment and what is considered just to be a statement but not a commandment. And that was going to be his outline. Now that book itself is a 2-volume work. It's not just a few pages, a 2-volume work where he enumerates the 613 commandments and shows what they're based on and gives a little bit of a background to these 613 commandments. Once he wrote that book, he was ready to write the Mishnah Torah, which took him 10 years. Now, if anyone today would like to do the same thing, no one would be able to do it. Because no one could be as brilliant as Maimonides in terms of the precision of every word. But let's say a book of that size that requires research, you would have to have, if a professor in any university, top-notch professor, would probably have to hire a staff of 25 graduate students, all with word processors, computers, and work on it for who knows how many decades. He did it single-handedly, and believe it or not, he didn't have a computer. And he didn't even have internet. So he couldn't converse with his colleagues. He did it single-handedly while he was busy with other things in 10 years, an encyclopedic work that covers all of Jewish knowledge. Every single subject in Judaism is covered in that work. And that was his main claim to fame. Without any question, that's his most important work. Although some would claim that the Guide for the Perplexed is the most important. But I would tend to disagree. Another famous letter that brought him even more fame and recognition was the letter to Yemen. Yemen suffered from another group, not the Almohads, but just as bad. They threatened to kill anyone who didn't profess Islam. There was a false messiah, a crazy person who declared himself the messiah, and this was causing a lot of stress for the Jews who were afraid that they're going to be attacked because of this. And he wrote a letter, a classic letter, where he explains anti-Semitism. His theory of anti-Semitism is they're jealous that we're the chosen people, they're jealous that we have the Torah, and they're angry at God for choosing us, but you can't fight God, so let's fight the Jews. Let's kill the Jews. And this letter made him so prominent in Yemen that to this day, the people who are the most strongly attached to Maimonides are Yemenite Jews. And it's another interesting fact is that Maimonides was a perfectionist. He revised every single one of his writings, especially the Mishnah Torah. He kept on correcting things. He sometimes changed his opinion. He would change the language to make it more precise. But where did he send his new corrections? To Yemen. In his own town, he wasn't as highly respected. He was highly respected, but not as much as he was in Yemen. So even today, we have the writings of Maimonides, the later writings of his, from Yemenite sources. There was a rabbi who passed away about 10, 15 years ago, Rabbi Kapach, a Yemenite rabbi who republished all of Rambam's writings that were written in Arabic. He retranslated them and issued them based on the latest corrections of Rambam that no one else in Europe had. Only the Yemenites had that. And they held him in such high regard that they would add his name in the Kaddish. They would say that, the Kaddish talks about how God's name will be magnified in such time when the redemption will occur, and they would add in the lifetime of Rabbi Moses ben Maimon. And there's no group of people who had held him in such high regard as the Yemenite Jews. What made him famous, and even more famous amongst the non-Jews, was the Guide for the Perplexed. But he didn't write that for non-Jews. He wrote it for Jews who were perplexed. And if you read it and you're not perplexed, you'll become perplexed. Because the Guide for the Perplexed was written for people who were steeped in Judaism, very well versed in Jewish texts, but were also steeped in Aristotelian philosophy, which was the big deal in those days. That was the science of those days, and the philosophy. And Aristotle and Maimonides held Aristotle in very high regard as well. And they found that there's some conflict between the two, between what Judaism says about religion, about God, about creation, about so many different things. And that was at variance with what Aristotle said. And Aristotle was based on logic, and therefore, if logic tells you that, for example, that Aristotle didn't believe that God created the universe was always here, just as God was always here. He wasn't an atheist, but he didn't believe in creation. And the Torah says God created the world, so they were saying, you know what? We have to follow logic, and logic dictates it, because Aristotle said it, he must have based it on logic. And therefore, we don't believe in creation anymore. And many other things like that. So Maimonides wrote a book to resolve all the supposed conflicts and the real conflicts between Torah and Aristotelian philosophy. And he refutes Aristotle on many of the things that he said that are at odds with the Torah. The Guide for the Perplexed was written for a very specific audience. And it was written for an audience for whom rationality and logic were their gods. Yes, they believed in God, but they believed that God has to be rational and logical. And therefore, Maimonides takes the commandments. The guide is divided into three parts. One part takes the commandments and explains them rationally. So Maimonides developed a reputation as being a rationalist, which means he believed that rationality and logic dictates everything. That is absolutely false. Maimonides loved logic, but he was not wed to logic, because Maimonides in the guide itself admits that there are some commandments that I don't understand. I can't give you a logical explanation, but we still do them. But in his Mishnah Torah, he's even more unequivocal about how there are commandments that are beyond our understanding, and we do it because God said so. Did Maimonides believe in miracles? Some say no. Obviously, he couldn't believe in miracles because that's not rational. But Maimonides himself argues against the false Messiah in Yemen. He says, well, the proof that he's not the Messiah is because he had never performed miracles. Well, if miracles don't exist, then how could you fault someone for not performing miracles? Maimonides did have a philosophy that miracles were programmed into nature, which means that when God created the world, he programmed that something will happen at a certain time that will go against what we consider to be nature. So he tried to make miracles as accessible to nature as possible, but he didn't deny the belief in miracles. Maimonides also wrote other works. Maimonides had a lot of critics, and they seized everything that he wrote. They went with a fine-tooth comb through every word, every line of his writings to try to get him, because he was very controversial. His ideas and the way he did things was very different from the way people before him did things. So one of the controversies, just one of the many controversies, swirled around the accusation that he did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. One of the beliefs in Judaism, it's in the Torah, in the biblical, and it's hinted in the 5 books of Moses and the end of Deuteronomy. God says, I bring death and I bring life. And it's right next to it says, I bring illness and I bring health, recovery. So you're talking about the person who was sick gets better, then the person who dies comes back to life. And it's written in many other places in Tanakh. But he was accused that he didn't believe in it. To this day, I can't fathom how anyone could have said that he didn't believe in it, because when he establishes the 13 principles of faith, the 13th principle is the resurrection of the dead. Moreover, in his Mishnah Torah, he writes that if a person denies that, he loses his share of the resurrection. He will not arise with the resurrection of the dead. So he clearly believed in it. But they seize on the fact that when he discusses the 12 principles of faith, he elaborates on them. But when he discusses the 13th, he doesn't elaborate. He just says it, the dead will come back to life, period. That's it. So they said, he probably doesn't really believe in it. I don't know how they came to that conclusion. But Maimonides defended himself. He wrote a whole book. It's a letter, but it's a very long letter. It can be considered a book into itself, where he defends his belief unequivocally in the resurrection of the dead, and he brings proofs from biblical sources. And yet, even after he wrote that, his critics still said he doesn't believe in it. We know what you really believe in. The chutzpah for people to think like that. Another one of his works are his letters, his responsa. People from all over the Jewish world wrote letters to him with questions of Jewish law, questions on his Mishnah Torah, and he responded to them mostly in Arabic. In fact, the only work he wrote in Hebrew was the Mishnah Torah, and someone asked him to translate it into Arabic, and he said, I'm sorry, I regret that I wrote all my books in Arabic, because there's been such a demand for it in Hebrew that if I had the chance, I would have written them in Hebrew. But you want me to take my Hebrew writings and translate into Arabic? He said, I'm not interested in that. But the letters that he wrote to people were written in the language that people wrote to him, I guess. And if they wrote to him in Arabic, he responded in Arabic. So I have 3 volumes of his letters. I'm sure there's more than that, but those 3 volumes were preserved. He also wrote 10 medical books, and his approach to medicine is holistic. He also recognized psychosomatic ailments, and he was very much into preventative medicine. And this is not the place to go into depth into what Maimonides innovated in medicine, but everything that he did, that he wrote then, even doctors today appreciate the brilliance and the efficacy of his treatments and for many diseases. he passed away in 1204 and was not buried in Egypt where he lived. He asked to be buried in Tiberias. And there's a story, I can't vouch for it. I don't know what the original source for it is. But the story is that when they carried his coffin to Israel, when they got to Israel, some bandits thought that so many people following a wagon with a big box in it, it must be some treasure. So they attacked the group and everyone fled, and they opened it up and they saw a body, so they left. And the horses kept on going until they landed in Tiberias. And that's where he was buried. Some people say the reason he's buried there because his father was buried there. His father, Rabbi Maimon, and that makes sense that he would want to be buried where his father was buried. But there's also a spiritual explanation for Tiberias. Tiberias has a special distinction in that when the temple was destroyed, even before the temple was destroyed, the Sanhedrin, the supreme court of Israel that embodied the authority for the entire Jewish people, and they embodied all of Jewish Torah knowledge, they left the temple precincts 40 years before the temple was destroyed, and they went to a place called Yavna. And from Yavna they went to another place, I believe it was Usha, and they kept on going, moving around because of the persecution and other conditions, and they ended up, after 10 wanderings, in a city called Tiberias. And our sages tell us that when Mashiach comes, the Sanhedrin will be reconstituted in Tiberias, and from there it'll move back until it gets to the temple in Jerusalem. So for some reason, Maimonides identified with Tiberias. Maimonides brings that tradition, and he identified with it because Maimonides was a miniature Sanhedrin. He contained all of Jewish knowledge and the authority that no one else had comparable to his. But he had many controversies in his life. Number one, the Almohads, the fanatical Muslims who did not allow Jews to be openly Jewish. He fought against the Karaites, who were Jewish. He fought against the Babylonian rabbis. That's a long story. I'm not going to go into it. But the Babylonia, which is now Iraq, was the center of Jewish scholarship longer than any other place in the world, including Israel. Jews were in Babylonia before the destruction of the first temple, and they stayed there for centuries until 1948. There was always a sizable Jewish community in Iraq until the establishment of the State of Israel. Two of Israel's chief rabbis, Rabbi Avadi Yosef and Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu, are Iraqi rabbis. Iraq produced some of the greatest scholars in modern times, not only in ancient times. So the Babylonian Gaonate, the leaders were called Gaonim. They had a tradition that when a Gaon, the leader, would pass away, it was hereditary. The son took over. Maimonides was opposed to that idea, that it should be hereditary. But also, he was opposed to a lot of their interpretations of the Talmud. And there was like a big feud going on, long-distance feud between the Babylonian sages and Maimonides. And they criticized him very harshly, very severely. So that was another type of controversy that he had to contend with. But the controversies revolved around many ideas. He didn't believe in remuneration for rabbis, as I mentioned before. He was against those who took the Torah literally and translated God's hands, God's eyes, literally, that God has hands and he has eyes. He fought against that. In fact, 1/3 of the Guide for the Perplexed is about that very subject, showing that whenever the Torah uses anthropomorphic terms, that means whenever it describes God in physical ways, it's not to be taken literally. And there were rabbis who did take it literally, and he fought against them. He fought against the belief in demons or astrology. His 13 principles of faith was controversial. Not because anyone said that we don't believe in those things, but he said, since when do you single out 13 principles of all of Judaism? Judaism is much more than 13. And some said if you already want to condense it to 13, we could condense it into 6 or 3. So that was controversial. Again, as I mentioned before, they denied that he believed in the resurrection of the dead, which was, of course, false. The whole idea of classifying the 613 commandments in the Book of Commandments was also controversial because his predecessors, Reb Sadia Gaon and others, had a different way of systemizing or classifying the commandments. So they were critical of him for changing the existing way of classifying them. One of the greatest controversies was about the Mishnah Torah itself. There was a rabbi who people say were equal to Maimonides in Talmudic scholarship, although not in other areas, known as the Raavad, Rabbi Abraham ben David, who lived in southern France, Provence. And he wrote critical notes on Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, very sharp criticisms, where he takes Maimonides to task. But his biggest criticism was, he says, I don't understand, Maimonides. You wrote a book containing all of Jewish law, and you don't mention any sources. Where did you get it from? So if you don't give me the source, how do I know whether I agree with you or I disagree with you? Since that criticism came about, there were many commentaries who provide the sources, but Maimonides himself didn't, and he regretted it years later. He himself said once, someone asked me the source for a particular point, and I couldn't remember it. If only I had written the sources, I wouldn't have had this problem. Even the way he organized Jewish law was different from the Talmudic system of organization, and he was criticized for that. The fact that he synthesized Torah with Greek philosophy was a major bone of contention. Many of the rabbis said, why are you bringing in Greek philosophy? That's heresy. We shouldn't be studying Greek philosophy. And Maimonides, of course, was a very great proponent of Greek philosophy, at least where it didn't conflict with Judaism. But his critics were very much against it. And in fact, probably a century later after Maimonides' passing, the rabbis condemned his writings to be burnt. They got the church to burn his writings because they felt that they were bordering on heresy. The rabbi who had his writings burnt was Rabbi Yonah, one of the greatest rabbis of his time. And then he realized the terrible mistake that he committed, because the Catholic Church said, why are we just burning Maimonides' writing? Let's burn all Jewish writings. And they burnt wagon loads, 24 wagon loads of Talmud, handwritten copies of the Talmud. And when that happened, Rabbi Yonah says, I was wrong. Maimonides was right. And he wrote a book called The Gates of Repentance. It's one of the greatest classics of repentance. And everyone believes that he wrote it for himself. That shows you the greatness of great Jewish leaders, that when they make a mistake, not only do they not admit it, but they write a book about it, how to repent. So these are some of the controversies. We didn't have time to speak about Rabbi Schneur Zalman. We'll do that next week, God willing. And then we'll try to show the similarities and the differences between them. If anyone has any questions about Maimonides. Yes?
So before Maimonides, was there 600, was it classified as 600?
Yes, the Talmud says that there are 613 commandments. They didn't give a round number. So almost nobody understood that to mean, it's a round number. They took it to mean very precise. It's a precise number. But if you count the number of times in the Torah it says, do this, don't do this, it's many more than 613. So what did the rabbis mean when they said 613? So I'll give you an example where it's easy to figure out that you don't count a commandment. It says in the Torah you're not supposed to do work on the Sabbath. How many times is that repeated in the Torah? About a half a dozen times. That's counted as one commandment. It's the same thing. Just because the Torah repeats it doesn't mean we count it as a separate commandment. An area where there's a dispute, in the Torah it says when you fight the wars against your enemy, don't fear your enemy. So Maimonides took that as a commandment. They're not allowed to fear your enemy. Well, how could you stop a person from fear? It means don't act in a way that will encourage fear. Don't tell people, I'm frightened, I'm terrified. Don't create that. His critic says, no, that's not a commandment, that's a statement. God is saying to us that you will be strong and you will not fear your enemy. So it's a question of interpretation. Is it a commandment or is it a statement? And then there are certain commandments that are very general. The Torah will tell you, follow my commandments. That's not a specific commandment. You don't count that. So Rambam actually establishes 14 ground rules to determine how you count a commandment. But others before him and after him had different ground rules, and they also come up to the number 613. So it's really mostly an academic issue. There are not that many practical differences, because everyone agrees that most of them are commandments. The question is, how do you classify it? There's an English book called Taryag. Taryag is 613, where he goes through all the different views.
Is there any one book by Maimonides that would be understandable to a layperson?
Yes, the depends. The Mishnah Torah, for example, parts of it are very clear and intelligible. For example, the second section of the 83 sections of the Mishnah Torah is called the Laws of Deot. Deot means dispositions. He talks about how to live an ethical life. He talks about for example, he talks about how terrible anger is, how terrible ego is. He goes into that, and it's very easy to read. That's one of the books. The books of Kings, the last of the 83 sections, deals with the laws concerning a king, a monarch. And the last 2 chapters are about the laws concerning Mashiach. Very easy to read. And there's much more that you can read. There's a book called a Maimonides Reader. It was condensed by Dr. Isidore Twersky from Harvard, if I'm not mistaken. And most of what that he has in that book is very easy to read. But 80% of Rambam's work are not easy to read. There's also his commentary in the Mishnah. There are parts of it that are easy to read. His introduction to the commentary covers Jewish history from the point of view of Jewish law, and it's been translated, I think, more than once, and that's easy to read. Any other questions?
Say that there's no such a thing as a Jewish community that does not have a charity fund? I had once heard that a Jewish community.
Yeah. A Jewish community has to have a fund for feeding the hungry, and even for visitors who are going through the town. Those are definitely. There's a section where he talks about the laws of tzedakah, of charity. It's everyone have probably heard of the 8 levels of charity. Well, that's Maimonides. That's something that everyone could read and understand. I remember once there was a professor, Chabad professor from Toronto, Rabbi Emanuel Shachat, and he delivered a lecture about Maimonides at Cornell University. And after the lecture, one of the very leading professors, Dr. Black, he was a great philosopher, he got up and he says, "I don't believe there was one Maimonides. There must have been at least 2." He couldn't accept the fact that one person could have accomplished so much and such diverse directions. There must have been 2 Maimonides. Maimonides, just to conclude, even though he was very controversial in his lifetime, even more controversial after he passed away, in the last 500 years, there is no controversy about Maimonides. It has been settled, and everyone in the Jewish community of those who are into Jewish scholarship, everyone holds Maimonides in the highest of regard. It doesn't mean that we follow everything Maimonides writes, because we also believe that there are other opinions, and we go by the majority. For example, Rabbi Yosef Karo, the one who wrote the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, his system was to take the 3 great teachers of Jewish law and decisors of Jewish law. One was called the Rif, nothing to do with Raf. The Rif was a sage about 1,000 years ago. He was Maimonides' teacher's teacher, and he had bridged the entire Talmud to distill the Talmud from the discussion, distill it into the practical final outcome. So he was like one of the most important sources of Jewish law. A few centuries later, in Germany, in the 15th, 16th century, you had Rabbi Usher, known as the Rush. So he was an Ashkenazic rabbi, and he collected all of the later teachings that were added on after the Rif. And then you have Rambam, Maimonides. So Rabbi Yosef Karo, when he wrote the Code of Jewish Law, he says, I'm going to look at those three, and if two of the three agree to something, I'll follow that opinion. And that's how Rabbi Yosef Karo decided. And there are others who had a different system of deciding, not necessarily based on only those three. So sometimes we do things contrary to Maimonides' opinion, not because we have less respect for him, because the way of Jewish law doesn't go by who the greatest scholar is. It goes by the majority. In the Talmud, there's a famous story of the rabbis arguing about a certain issue, and the minority view refused to give in to the majority. And then he was a holy person, and he invoked the divine. There was a heavenly voice that said, he's right. The minority view is right. And the majority view proponent got up and says, we don't listen to heavenly voices. The Torah was given to us. We decide based on the majority. So Maimonides, with all due respect, we don't follow everything that he says in terms of his opinion when it's against other opinions that are in the majority. But everyone believes in Maimonides as one of the greatest Jewish scholars and leaders of all times. So much so that there were great Hasidic masters who said that if Mashiach would have come in his lifetime, he would have been the Mashiach, Maimonides. They don't say that about other great people of his time, they say it about him specifically. The Rabbi instituted a study of Maimonides and a system where we study 3 chapters a day of his Mishnah Torah. There are only 1,000 chapters in the Mishnah Torah. So if you do the math, it takes a little less than a year to complete it. For those who are not so capable, he said they can do 1 chapter a day, so they finish it in 3 years. And for those who that's too much, they should learn the companion work, the Book of Commandments, the commandments that relate to the Mishnah Torah of that day. And that a lot of people do. It takes just a few minutes to do. If you want to get into that system, there's a website. You can go, probably Chabad.org will probably steer you to that Maimonides website. And that way, when you cover in a year, you'll cover all 613 commandments in a way that's like you studied all of Judaism in 1 year. Any questions from the Zoomites?
Is there any one of the commandments that...
Thank you, Rabbi. Have a good
Thank
day,
you.
and everybody.
You too. Yes? Any what?
Any one of the commandments that is more controversial than all the others?
Controversial commandments. Circumcision. That's a controversial one. It depends where and depends when. The Greeks didn't like circumcision, neither did the Romans. They didn't want us to do it. The Greeks didn't like Shabbat. It depends on the season.